But literary classics are made, not born. And so today, I want to tell you one part of a very complex story about how The Stranger, a book very few readers understood or appreciated when it was published in 1942, became a household name, a regular on lists of the great books of the century, cited in this country in the company of other classics, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. I'm going to focus on a key episode in The Stranger's American career, the first translation of the novel into English in the United States and England 4 years after its publication in 1946. The war in Europe had been over for only a year. The story I'm about to tell you is a tale of two cities involving an author, his publishers, his translator, and his readers and reviewers. Although few Americans had read L'Étranger when it first came out in French, it had been almost impossible to find a copy in wartime France, word of the novel had crossed the ocean. Blanche Knopf, who founded Knopf with her husband Alfred in 1915, had a special interest in publishing translations of contemporary French literature. She'd been cut off from Europe for the duration of the war, but by February 1945, she was back in touch with her agent in Paris. Sartre, the great Sartre, had lauded a new Camus novel, still in manuscript, called The Plague, in a lecture he gave at Harvard in 1945. Blanche Knopf immediately cabled Paris asking to see the manuscript. The Plague, with its links to the suffering and heroism of France during the German occupation, was bound to make a splash, and she understood that Knopf might also have to buy The Stranger in order to get The Plague, which she considered a more exciting and relevant book. Alfred Knopf cabled the agent Bradley in February, eager to acquire The Plague, but Camus hadn't even finished writing the novel. Knopf hesitated. In March 1945, he decided to make an offer of $350 for translation rights on The Stranger, with an option to buy rights for The Plague when it was finished. The British were more enthusiastic than the Americans. Cyril Conley, a magazine editor and critic who was on record declaring that the European novel was a wasteland, saw a whole new start for fiction itself in what Camus had written. He brought The Stranger immediately to the attention of publisher Jamie Hamilton, who purchased British rights in February 1945 with an advance of £75. Hamilton asked Conley to provide an introduction. Hamilton also chose the translator, Stuart Gilbert, a friend of James Joyce, who had a good track record translating novels like Man's Fate by André Malraux. Knopf and Hamilton agreed to share translation costs. In June, Blanche Knopf made her first post-war buying trip to Paris and finally met Camus in person in her old spot at the Ritz Hotel on the Place Vendôme. Let's imagine her for a moment. She liked to meet authors earlier in the day, smoking Chesterfields on a couch in the hotel's vast corridor, a space that remained quiet until afternoon tea was served. She would ask for information about up-and-coming French writers and was known to say, "That's not good enough for America," when she didn't like a suggestion. With Camus, however, she let down her guard and listened. It was the beginning of a long and devoted literary friendship. Stuart Gilbert worked fast. By September 1945, he'd sent his complete manuscript to Knopf and Hamilton with instructions and with a title, The Stranger. On January 10, Jamie Hamilton sent corrected galleys of the translation to Blanche Knopf in New York. By galleys, you know, I mean the bound typeset pages that always precede a published book, allowing author and editor to make last-minute corrections. But there was a bombshell in his letter. the announcement of a fait accompli, and I'll quote it because it's a little hard to read. I send you herewith a set of corrected galleys of Camus' L'Étranger, which we have decided to call The Outsider, both because we consider this a more striking and appropriate title than The Stranger, and because Hutchinson's recently called one of their Russian novels The Stranger. In 1945, Hutchinson's, a rival British publisher, released what was actually a Polish novel in English translation, which bore the unfortunate title The Stranger. Hamilton feared that Camus' book might be confused with it. On the New York end, it was too late to switch titles from The Stranger to The Outsider. Hamilton was sending galleys, but those galleys were as unexpected as the title change, for Knopf had already typeset the book for themselves so that it could be available for Camus' spring visit to New York. Blanche Knopf responded tersely to Hamilton's announcement, quote, I had assumed when I received the manuscript, because it had instructions on it from Stuart Gilbert, it was setting copy. We read it very carefully and made any necessary corrections. Certainly, if I'd known there was a chance of corrected galleys, I would not have said, and wish you might have cabled me the new title, which I can well understand you're using. Hamilton hadn't cabled, nor had he telephoned. This was the immediate post-war world. Obviously, there was no internet, no cell phones. But even harder for us to fathom in our contemporary context is the fact that people didn't just pick up the phone in London to call New York. Knopf and Hamilton, the two publishers, may have shared the English language, but they were separated by a vast ocean in very different expectations. On the English side, it hadn't occurred to Jamie Hamilton that Knopf would go to the trouble of producing the book separately without waiting for his own galleys. Was Hamilton being patronizing? Was Knopf being presumptuous? This combination of an assumption for control on the British side and an assumption of independence on the American side make for a fitting allegory of British-American relations going back to the revolution that separated us. For years, no one has been able to explain why Camus' L'Étranger has two different English language titles. An Algerian critic argued recently in a review of Sandra Smith's 2013 translation of L'Étranger, called The Outsider, that the title The Outsider is politically scandalous, for it effaces the ambiguity in the French word l'étranger and substitutes a more banal idea of someone being excluded. He thought Smith's 2013 title was new, not realizing that the British have used the same title since 1946. The two titles tempt us, in fact, tempted me before I found the piece of paper, to fill in the blank with cultural or political theories. So, for example, you could imagine that in Melting Pot, New York, the immigrant firm of Knopf had a sense of foreignness that directed them towards the stranger, whereas Hamilton in class-conscious Britain was more aware of social exclusion, hence the outsider. And neither theories hold water, as we saw from the brief exchange between Hamilton and Knopf. Only marketing issues and timing explain why L'Étranger was born into the English language as fraternal twins. Same text, different typography, covers, and titles. I like to think of the two editions as existentialist twins. The doubling has continued to this day, even as new translations have replaced Gilbert's. No matter who is translating, the British edition is called The Outsider, the American edition, The Stranger. Books about the stranger and the outsider, when they're published simultaneously in the US and in England, have to change titles for each edition or risk disorienting readers. So my book is called Looking for the Outsider in its English edition. If you ask someone, English or American, which title they prefer, chances are they'll answer the one I'm used to. So in discussion, I'd like to hear from you which title you prefer and why. The British edition of The Outsider bore a cover featuring an Arab, not really an Algerian Arab, I think, more like a Saudi Arab, in strong mosaic design, and a critical introduction by Cyril Conley. Conley's introduction is really worth rereading. He reminded readers that Algeria was a colony of France and that Camus seemed to give the Arab characters in the novel, particularly the Moorish woman beaten and reviled, none of the sympathetic attention to their dilemma that he had given to Meursault. Conley was writing in 1946 with an acute sense that India was about to gain its independence from the British Empire, which was fading. Despite, or perhaps because of the political salvo launched from the book's introduction, Jamie Hamilton was certain he had a bestseller on his hands, and he planned a first run of 10,000 copies over twice Gallimard's wartime print run of 4,400. At Knopf in New York, there was much more hesitation. In-house readers' reports were less than stellar. Now, see if you can recognize the novel you've read in the following remarks. Herbert Weinstock, opera specialist and Knopf advisor, had this to say about The Stranger, quote, "This extended short story, the translation does not exceed 30,000 words, is pleasant, unexciting reading. It seems to me neither very important nor very memorable, and it also seems to me to be padded with extraneous detail." He attributed the piling up of details, the flat tone, and what he called deliberate artlessness to a philosophical theory called existentialism, of which The Stranger could be considered a demonstration. Quote, my best guess is that it will appeal to very few readers and produce something less than a sensation. Another advisor called L'Étranger, quote, too slight to be worth translating, and filed a report with Knopf in January 45, dissatisfied with the scene that has gone down in literary history as the most stunning part of the novel. Quote, the actual moment of the shooting is not altogether convincing. The turning point of the story isn't credible. The book is limited. So Knopf had its work cut out. Here's the cover of the American edition. As The Stranger was about to go on sale in American bookstores, the publisher placed a full-page ad in Publishers Weekly. It was signed by Blanche Knopf and entitled On the New Literature of France. Actually, she convinced Justin O'Brien, a professor in the Columbia French department, to ghostwrite the ad. She wrote to O'Brien, "The booksellers are not buying Camus and do not know anything about the entire French trend." Jamie Hamilton liked to refer to this as Blanche's existentialist ad. Blanche Knopf was going to do everything possible to make The Stranger accessible and exciting. It's really hard to imagine Publishers Weekly today doing a full-page ad where some publisher is explaining, say, deconstruction or post-colonial theory or whatever. The advertisement began by sympathizing with the average reader's dilemma. Quote, there's no use trying to talk about the new French literature unless you are willing to tackle existentialism. Now, this is a frightening word. Everyone likes to show that he can pronounce it, but no one enjoys undertaking to define it. Well, here it goes. Very folksy style. Existentialism, the ad continued, is the notion that a consciousness of the universe's meaninglessness can make us free. Passing mention was then made of the fact that Camus, whose somber countenance gazed out from the upper right of the page, refused to be classified with the existentialists because their emphasis on meaninglessness was at odds with his belief in justice, in political justice. The author of The Stranger was introduced as a man who'd lived a double life during the occupation, publishing with the approval of the Nazi censor while editing a resistance newspaper underground. The Stranger was then presented in a few words, a novel as simple and straightforward as John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. Pitching The Stranger as both a lofty existentialist novel and a straightforward populist novel was clever, since reviewers could pick up on either strand, high or low. Pitching Camus as an existentialist and a champion for social justice was also a good idea. Here was an author both intelligent and heroic. After a month of what Blanche Knopf considered fantastic press, only 2,500 copies of the novel had sold. In 1946, The Stranger was not yet a bestseller. In the long run, however, the ad accomplished something more important than immediate sales. It introduced Camus to American magazine and newspaper publishers as a leading figure of a new school of French literature called existentialist, and it established that school as the most important new intellectual current coming out of France. You'd have to read the advertisement in Publishers Weekly twice over to glean that Camus disavowed the existentialist label, and in fact he detested it. He joked in an interview with a French magazine that he and Sartre decided they ought to put out their own ad, quote, stating that the undersigned have nothing in common and refuse to respond to any debts they might have incurred mutually. Yet it was Sartre who prepared the way for Camus' New York welcome. Sartre described Camus in Vogue magazine, an article written in English, as the emblematic writer to emerge from the resistance, the only writer who corresponded to his theory of a committed literature essential to the renewal of France. As Blanche Knopf learned, Sartre had read an early version of Camus' forthcoming The Plague in manuscript, and he was ready to vouch that the world was about to see a new Camus. The absurdity of the world in The Stranger and the myth of Sisyphus were giving way in this new work to positive revolt and struggle. The Plague, based on Camus' own commitment to the resistance, demonstrated that the human spirit could come to rule over the absurd world. These are words for today. Sartre made Camus a key to the future of French literature. Quote, "It is likely that in the somber, pure work of Camus are discernible the principal traits of French literature of the future." For Sartre, whose influence was tremendous, Camus represented most vividly the aspirations of post-war literature at a shining moment when writers and intellectuals felt the world was theirs to remake. No other writer could have fit the bill for Sartre. Malraux, too much of an individualist, Guénon and Mauriac, much older men, had chosen to publish nothing except underground, nothing above ground, while the communists were indebted to their own masters. Camus had done exactly what needed to be done during the occupation. He had marked time, but he had not accepted the oppression. He had chosen struggle rather than silence. 32 years old in 1945, he had reached the perfect age when youth meets maturity. Back in the US in January 1946, excuse me, and speaking to students at Yale about the French view of the American novel, Sartre singled out The Stranger as, quote, the French novel which caused the greatest furor between 1940 and 1945. He focused on Camus' debt to Hemingway, those short, disruptive sentences, which in Hemingway were a feature of the writer's temperament, but in Camus seemed rather to be a deliberate technique for expressing a philosophy of the absurd. Sartre said that each sentence of L'Étranger was like an island, separated from the next sentence by a sense of nothingness. It's a beautiful piece of criticism. Then he entertained his audience with stories, his American audience, with stories of the symbolic value of American literature under German occupation. He described the Café de Flore as the headquarters for a black market in American books. Not only did reading Faulkner and Hemingway novels become a symbol of resistance, he claimed. It was even the case, and forgive Sartre's strange sense of humor, that secretaries believed they could demonstrate against the Germans by reading Gone with the Wind in the metro. Sartre promised his audience 3 months before the English language publication of The Stranger that the first French novels written during the occupation were about to appear in the United States. He was rolling out a thick red carpet for his friend. So, as you see, a lot of preparation went into the publication of The Stranger in the US. This is Strange Water. After the confusion over the title, the tepid readers' reports, and the big push of the publisher's weekly ad, came one more important step: a visit by the author to the United States under the auspices of the cultural services of the French embassy. In the second half of my lecture, I'd like to recount that visit and the initial reactions of the American public to L'Étranger in translation. When the SS Oregon docked in the New York harbor on March 24, Camus was the only passenger held for questioning by immigration officials. He refused to answer any of their questions, which surely included what was then the standard for Cold War America. Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? He had. He was silent for several hours until a staff member from French Cultural Services intervened and vouched for the writer. Word of the incident reached J. Edgar Hoover, always on the lookout for the communist menace. Hoover ordered FBI surveillance and a report. Now, the FBI's major source of information was a light-hearted article published by Hannah Arendt in the left-wing magazine The Nation a month before Camus' arrival in Manhattan. In The French Existentialist, Arendt claimed that France had become a place where, quote, books so difficult as to require actual thinking sell like detective novels. The French existentialists were having more fun than any other intellectuals in the post-war world, she continued. And the two main representatives of this new existential movement were Sartre and Camus. After quoting Arendt at length, the report de-escalated the threat, pointing out that with the liberation, even the communists in France had turned to national concerns about the reconstruction of their country. In the end, the special agent Tierney concluded that there was really nothing to worry about. The unknown agent turning to me is really the hero of the story, for another agent might have given in to the reigning Cold War paranoia. Investigation fails to develop any subversive or political activity on subject's part. Informants state they believe the subject is striving in his lectures to establish a closer relationship between the cultural views of the US and France and to explain his philosophy of the absurd. This philosophy recommends living lucidly with the absurd, enjoying life all the more fully because it had no meaning, and taking advantage of the most complete liberty on earth once eternal liberty is suppressed. I'd say this is the kind of FBI we might want to bring back. Waiting patiently at Pier 88 to greet Camus that spring day was a man named Nicola Chiaramonte, an Italian friend who had sought refuge with Camus and his family in Algiers and Oran in 1941. He had accompanied Camus on bike trips to the beach that inspired The Stranger. He'd lived with Camus' in-laws in downtown Oran. Carole Monte had found safe passage to New York through Algeria, Morocco, and Portugal with Camus' help, and it was time to return his hospitality. The Italian refugee was already a prominent New York intellectual, publishing in the best small magazines. There would be no quiet walks on the beach for Camus and Chiaramonte, but instead many loud parties and evenings in honky-tonk bars and fancy New York apartments. Blanche and Alfred Knopf threw a swank party to launch The Stranger on the rooftop garden of the Astor Hotel on Times Square. But Camus didn't even mention it in his New York diary. Despite what the existentialist ad said, the novel he conceived in 1939 and perfected in the depths of the occupation no longer corresponded to his thinking or his mood. The specialist of the flat first-person narrative, the creator of the alienated and solitary morceau, had earned the right and privilege to step onto the lecture stage and speak as we, representing the aspirations of liberated France. 4 days after his arrival, Camus lectured at Columbia University. The event was a panel on post-war France, conceived and organized by the great anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss in 1946, as you know, was the cultural attaché in the New York offices of the French embassy. Camus was joined by 2 writers published by the Éditions de Minuit, the legendary underground press, Vercors, the author of the novel The Silence of the Sea, and a mathematician named Timeret. The event at Columbia was the talk of the town. Camus was hosted by Professor Justin O'Brien, the 20th century French literature specialist in the Columbia French department, who had only recently traded in his uniform for a professor's tweed coat, and who had ghostwritten the famous existentialist ad for Blanche Knopf. O'Brien announced in the New York Herald Tribune that Camus was the boldest writer in France today. The Columbia Spectator, the student newspaper, prepared the campus for Camus' talk. Quote, Camus, however, appears to live happily within this absurd and not to sacrifice his lucidity and contentedness at the altar of metaphysical revelation. Sounds a little bit like the FBI. It was a reassuring take on the myth of Sisyphus. Why be bogged down in the absurd when life is so much fun? The day before the event, O'Brien called on Camus and the other speakers at the Embassy, a mothy hotel at 70th and Broadway. Quote, the moment we were in his room and the athletic young man had stretched out on the bed with a few notes in front of him, he easily dominated the group. Camus' charisma, made of equal parts of physical presence, ease, and authority, worked its magic on men and women alike. O'Brien's impression of Camus as athletic may have been fanciful and certainly belied Camus' tenuous health. The young writer had survived the occupation, but he was suffering from the effects of a relapse of his adolescent tuberculosis that had struck him hard in 1942 that he hadn't been able to shake. Try to imagine this scene, a huge audience gathered in Columbia's Macmillan Theater, more than the university had ever seen for an event in French. 1,200 people crowded into a space designed for 600, some of them carrying copies of Combat. Camus was editor-in-chief of this newspaper, which had begun underground as part of a resistance movement, and now represented the aspirations for a new, more just society in liberation France. O'Brien remembered that everyone was eager to hear French spoken again and to see in flesh and blood some survivors of the black years of the occupation. Here are his fellow panelists. In his speech at Columbia entitled The Human Crisis, which still needs a good translation and reedition, Camus mentioned neither The Stranger nor the myth of Sisyphus. Speaking in French, he described his generation, born during the First World War, reaching adolescence during the Depression, coming of age during the Civil War in Spain, Munich, and the defeat, and living through an enemy occupation. He spoke with no regrets of the fashion for the absurd that had captured writers such as himself before the war, and of that literature in revolt against clarity, narration, and even the sentence. This was no longer his world. Camus was preoccupied, as were the characters in his novel In Progress, Plague, with preventing the return of a deadly scourge. Like an epidemic brought under control, Hitler's death ended one cycle of evil, but it should not make them complacent. He called for the elimination of the death penalty, for dialogue across borders, for indulgence towards others and rigor towards oneself. And he praised the Frenchmen who had been willing to die for the truth. He likened them to so many modern-day Socrates. After the losses from 2 world wars, he suggested, France would doubtless see history being made by other nations. French writers and thinkers faced a daunting task. They needed to emerge from the era of Nazism with pessimism about the world and optimism about mankind. You can, if you're interested, you can see Viggo Mortensen reenact this speech on YouTube in the very same theater on the very same day, only last year, and in English translation. But here's what interested me for our lighter-hearted purposes. A writer for The New Yorker who visited Camus in his room at the Embassy Hotel found him studying the Knopf translation of his novel with a puzzled expression on his face. Camus didn't read English very well, but he knew something was wrong. There are too many quotation marks in it, he told his visitor. I am sure there weren't that many quotation marks in the original. So let's take a look. I've got that quotation marks for you in red. You could see it pretty well in this chart. Any chance he got, Gilbert used quotations. Even a passing remark like, I answered no, became in Gilbert's version, I answered no. The change had huge consequences in tone and style and in the reader's relationship to Meursault. While Camus had chosen to use indirect speech to distance the reader from his narrator, to deprive us of direct dialogue, Gilbert preferred to report speech directly. Did he think it made the story livelier? It's impossible to know. In any case, his change created a very different mood. Like many talented translators faced with radical literary innovation, Stuart Gilbert wanted to make The Stranger sound good in idiomatic English. But he changed the style so drastically that anyone who knew the French and happened upon this version was appalled. 30 years later, a French professor named John Gale, who'd been asked to lecture on the novel to a group of students reading it in English, was so taken aback by his first contact with Gilbert's The Stranger that he wrote a manifesto called Does America Know the Stranger? And here are some of his damning examples. Oh, Gilbert translates j'arriverai as I should get there, and ce n'est pas de ma faute as sorry, sir, but it's not my fault, you know. Je ne sais pas in the French becomes I can't be sure in English. Meursault isn't indifferent in this translation, it's just that he can't make up his mind. Camus writes, Je prendrai l'autobus à 2 heures et j'arriverai dans l'après-midi, and Gilbert translates, with the 2 o'clock bus, I should get there well before nightfall. Gilbert's...
Did Gilbert know any French? No one checked it.
Let's talk, right. I don't know, he did not only not know French, he didn't read Sartre's incredibly perfect stylistic analysis, which would have made him aware of Camus' intentions. So here, for example, he's substituting a complex sentence structure for Camus' stripped-down sentences, and asserting causality, which was exactly what Camus was striving to avoid. And all of us who teach The Stranger know this, we teach this. Gilbert's sentences are no longer the islands that fascinated Sartre in the original. Gilbert also gives Raymond Santez, you remember him, a little cultural upgrade. Santez sounds British. You've knocked around the world a bit, Santez says to Meursault in Gilbert's translation, where Camus reports the conversation indirectly. Il voulait me demander un conseil, que moi j'étais un homme, je connaissais la vie. Camus had landed in New York on March 25th, 1946. On April 11, a more hesitant, classier, and vaguely more British Meursault stepped gingerly onto the pavements of American literature. In reviews from April to July 1946, there was a discrepancy between the political spokesman we just heard about, the man who spoke La Crise de l'Homme, and the solitary writer of The Stranger. Existentialism, from what American critics had read, appeared to be a practical and hopeful philosophy designed to pull France and the rest of the world out of the wartime morass. But the man in his novel didn't match. Camus, preoccupied with political change, had moved beyond the absurd. But The Stranger couldn't. It would forever be the fruit of Camus' solitude in Oran and Paris, a book conceived before the fall of France. The American press would try to make sense of the novel as a reflection of its author, who in their minds represented the resistance. And certain articles really had to force the connection. So View, a New York surrealist magazine, published a disdainful review of The Stranger, in which they claimed that Meursault was a collaborator. Camus' hero lives in a collaborationist world. He doesn't lose himself in action, but abandons hope and becomes a cynic. Camus' friend Carole Monte, on the other hand, considered Meursault a résistant. For him, there was a deep connection between Meursault's refusal to lie and Camus' own honesty, which gave The Stranger an ethical force that differentiated it from any of the American novels to which it was compared. The Talk of the Town column in the New Yorker, always kind of snarky, still snarky, published a sketch entitled The Absurdist. The magazine brought the French literary star down to size by describing him as a cartoonish-looking character whose skinny frame showed the effects of the occupation diet and whose suit was 10 years out of date. Camus, in his own journals, complained about American bad taste, the ugliest neckties he had ever seen. He wrote to Janine and Michel Gallimard in Paris that the girls at Vogue were calling him the little Bogart, and he figured he could probably get a film contract whenever he wanted. One young journalist at Vogue named Patricia Blake became his American companion, and she grew close enough to Camus to notice his sudden sweats and fevers without quite realizing that he suffered from tuberculosis. Camus went on a tour to several East Coast campuses. Like Simone de Beauvoir a year later, but in a more ironic key, he was amazed by American students, particularly the women. At Vassar College on April 6, 1946, he wrote, quote, "An army of young starlets who recline on the lawns with their long legs crossed. What they do for young people here is worth remembering." He was only 32, but with the war and the underground struggle behind him, not to mention his poor health, Camus felt decades older than those students. He wasn't the first European to complain about American optimism. "In this country," he wrote, "everything is done to prove that life is not tragic, and the young people feel as if something is missing." And he added, "This effort is pathetic because you have to reject the tragic after looking at it, but not before." Meanwhile, the literary establishment was pronouncing both on The Stranger and on its author. In the Sunday New York Times, John L. Brown wrote from Paris. He evoked the fear, the hunger, the dim lights of the recovering city in which Camus' novel found its meaning. Camus, he explained, was the person to whom the tormented, uncertain, but always courageous adolescents of post-liberation France come to discuss their problems with someone who they feel understands them better than anyone else, He thought that Camus was an apostle. The Stranger didn't fare very well with Edmund Wilson, great literary critic. Edmund Wilson, writing in the New Yorker, he found the novel sociologically inconsistent. If what Meursault wants is to keep the Arabs in their place, and even that isn't sure, quote, he ought to be shown as himself being kicked or squeezed by some other social group. In other words, Wilson just wanted a realist novel. Charles Poor also wrote about Algeria. A journeyman critic for the New York Times who had served with the Civil Affairs Division in North Africa and Italy. He was the first U.S. critic to address the men who had landed on the coast of Algeria in 1942. You know, we all remember D-Day, but we forget that the Allies liberated Algeria in November 1942. And he writes, "The scene of The Stranger is Algiers, not the Algiers full of Allied uniforms and armament and confusion and jeeps roaring up the Rue Michelet that so many Americans have known, but a purely French and Arab Algiers of some time before the war hit that steep town. The frying wet heat of summer, however, is familiar." Brown didn't make the darker connection between Meursault's crime and the Second World War. The fact that millions of Americans, whether they had fought in Normandy, in North Africa, or in the Pacific, were living with the memory of killing a nameless enemy. To them, The Stranger held out a dark and grimly satisfying mirror. As for the Arab in the story, Poor remarked, but only in parentheses, "Incidentally, the fate of the Arab's family is completely overlooked in the proceedings." It would be several decades before American critics grappled with that aspect of the novel. Let me leave you with a mystery. Despite the real problems of the Gilbert translation, despite the tension between Camus' persona and his novel, readers seemed to grasp what was essential. The novel took hold. I can't explain it. Maybe it helped that Pantheon Books published a French language edition of The Stranger in New York in 1946. And there were many Americans in those days who could read the original. I mean, it would be ordinary if I was speaking to a room like this in New York or Minneapolis for as many people to know French as you all know French. What I like about this is that the Pantheon edition is an exact negative of one of Gallimard's traditional white covers. It's an homage to L'Étranger's Birthright that dresses the book in post-war mourning. I'm glad to talk about why in discussion. We know that 40 years after the first U.S. translation of The Stranger, Charles Poor's parenthetical remark about the Arab would become absolutely central. The Stranger, marketed by Blanche Knopf in 1946 as a philosophical expression of existentialism, would morph into a much more political book. And students and teachers would begin to debate, as Cyril Conley had proposed in his 1946 introduction, the meaning of a story where the Arab victim has no name and no language. The life of a book goes on well beyond the life of its author. It grows and changes, expands and contracts with new generations of readers. Its good health, its very survival, is dependent upon the new questions we ask of it. Which brings me to conclude very briefly. In 2013, Kamel Daoud, an Algerian writer, published a novel about the brother and mother of Meursault's victim called The Meursault Investigation. He gives Meursault's Arab victim a name, Moussa, and he gives him a surviving brother named Haroun, who tries with difficulty to find out what happened to the writer who killed his brother in a book. He has created a fascinating mix of criticism and fiction, both dependent on the plot of The Stranger, but ultimately, I think, flying free from its sources. Camus' bold repurposing is only one example in a 75-year-old history of reinventions of the stranger. The power of Camus' book to inspire strong responses in Nazi-occupied France, in post-war America, in modern-day Algeria, is proof of its strength. As long as people keep reading novels, the stranger will live on, and that's more of a guarantee of an afterlife than any author and most books can hope for. Thank you. Time for a few questions? Yeah? Yes. Absolutely. He even took specific images and details from his court reporting. I think that his court reporting is really worth reading. He was learning how to, for example, give a portrait very quickly of someone. He was learning his way around a courtroom. And what he has to do in The Stranger is show Meursault, first person, show Meursault in the courtroom as if he'd never seen it before. But of course for Camus, it's completely familiar. And there's that wonderful moment in The Stranger where Meursault is looking out at the court and he sees a young reporter with a pen in his hand and he says, Meursault says, I have the odd impression that I was looking at myself. So that's really Camus winking at us and telling us that his court reporting is a source. Remember the examining magistrate in The Stranger who brandishes a crucifix before Meursault? He took that from a trial where the judge brandished a crucifix. A trial of a guy named Sheikh El-Akbi who was murdered. He was murdered by, who was a very conservative guy who was murdered by a reformist. And oops, I don't want to become separated from my mic here. I'm getting a little carried away. So he took the detail from that. He does another thing that I think is taking a detail from his court reporting. There's a funny moment at the end of a trial where Camus, the reporter, writes that as the verdict is being pronounced, he hears church bells. So there's a church right next to the Palais de Justice in Algiers. And in The Stranger, as Meursault's trying to hear the defense lawyer's speech, he hears the horn of an ice cream truck. So to me, that's really that's what the absurd is. It's a church bell turned into the horn of an ice cream truck. So yeah, it was totally enabling for him. I think he didn't even have, until he went into the courtroom, he really didn't have a novel in him. So, it's very interesting. There's a lot of speculation in his correspondence. For example, he was mentored by a man named Pascal Pillat, who was a great resistance fighter and who brought Camus into the underground resistance. And when he first sent out The Stranger, Gallimard asked him if he wanted to publish excerpts from it in the Nouvelle Revue Française, and he refused. Pillat said to him, the Nouvelle Revue Française is completely putrid, don't go near it. And he was a first-time writer who was a provincial from Algiers, and this was his big event, I mean, Vercors was a much older guy, Guénaud, who was also writing underground. These were men, Guénaud had a salary. I mean, Camus was hungry, he was eager, he was really young. And he was worried that Gallimard would be unhappy if he didn't agree to put the excerpts in the Nouvelle Revue Française. But Pillat said, if he had to blush every time somebody said no to the Nouvelle Revue Française, he'd be in really bad shape, because everyone was refusing to be in the Nouvelle Revue Française. So he published it. It went before the German censor, the Propagandestaffel, and the guy, Gerhard Heller, I mean, it's really hard to know what the truth value is of what Gerhard Heller said, many years later in his memoirs. He said that he got the manuscript and he stayed up all night, and it was apolitical and asocial. Well, what does it mean for a Nazi to say that the stranger is apolitical and asocial? Does it mean that it's okay to kill an Arab? I mean, I actually think the censor was not content-laden. It's just that if there was a book with, and it wasn't a Jewish author, and it didn't talk about the Allies, and it didn't recommend resistance, the book got through. Well, on the other hand, Myth of Sisyphus had a chapter on Kafka. They didn't even send it for to the censor. They knew it wouldn't make it through. So they removed the chapter on Kafka. Camus substituted a chapter on Dostoevsky, but he immediately published the Kafka chapter in the unoccupied zone with a magazine called L'Arbalète. So yeah, you know, I think that there are very few pure lives. I mean, I don't get too upset about this, especially given what I know about Camus' resistance and you know, what he did and what he wrote. But I know people like to hand out, you know, grades for resistance and collaboration and so on. It's very complicated. I appreciate your question. Your other question was, yes. So what translation of The Stranger should we be reading? So Matthew Ward in 1988, a student of the poet and translator Richard Howard, retranslated The Stranger for Knopf Random House. And it's a really beautiful translation. I only take exception with one line. There's a beautiful phrase at the end, la tendre indifférence du monde. You know, I'm opening my heart to the tender indifference of the world. And for some reason he says gentle indifference of the world, which, you know. Whereas Gilbert says execrable howls or something like that. It's really crazy. So that's a good translation. Sandra Smith translated for Viking. It's not available in the US. I don't think I was even able to get it at the Village Voice when it first came out. I wanted a copy of it. I had to go on Amazon.uk and order it. Some people like that, but I'm really happy with the Matthew Ward. I don't think it needs a retranslation, whereas The Plague probably does. Well, that actually I think is written into French law, that there is some aspect of the French judgment that involves a judgment on the whole person. So in the first part of the trial, there's always this interrogation.
But he didn't believe in God that he, you know.
I mean, that was Camus' way of, this is my interpretation, but by showing a trial in which the murder of an Arab has absolutely no effect on the verdict, Camus is saying, look how racist a society this is. And it's really the same way with the fact that he didn't give a name to the Arab. So when Camus was writing The Stranger, he read a novel by James M. Cain called The Postman Always Rings Twice, which took place on the highways of Los Angeles during the Depression. It was a very racist atmosphere. It was about an adulterous couple who plot to kill the woman's husband, who's Greek. Throughout the novel, the guy is called the Greek, especially in the moments of violence and when they're dealing with the body, because they want to dehumanize him. When you don't name somebody, the person loses their humanity. And Camus read this novel in 1936, and I'm convinced that when he saw the Greek, he thought, now there's a technique. I'll call him the Arab. And it'll really express this violent racist society.
Well, it's also the Jew during that moment in history. So.
Well, the Jew, yeah. And one of the things that fascinated me the most was when I studied the fight on the beach that inspired Camus, you know, that all the biographers talk about. And I looked into the two people who were in the fight on the beach. That's the end of my book. The fight was between an Algerian Jew and an Arab. And they spoke the same language. Most Algerian Jews spoke Algerian Arabic. So it wouldn't have been a silent fight. So Camus was always abstracting. He was always removing details. I mean, it's a fun exercise for students. Rewrite The Stranger, making the people in the fight an Algerian Jew and an Arab. I had even thought at one point describing him as autistic or Asperger's. It felt like it was doing too much of a diagnosis of a literary character, which I really didn't want to do. But it's a very astute remark, and I appreciate your openness about your family. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that Camus must have known people who didn't quite respond the right way. And there's one trial that I talk about where there's a man on trial who was injured in a workplace accident, and Camus writes, or whoever covered the trial, because this particular article isn't signed, it says, he didn't have the right response to social situations. Clearly he chose to have every answer be a little off. You know, remember that scene where he goes swimming with Marie, and she asks him when they get dressed why he's wearing a black armband. He says, oh yeah, my mother died, funeral was yesterday, and sort of her mouth hangs open, you know, she just doesn't know what to make of it. Yeah. Which Algeria? Because obviously before '62 it's French school system and it's being taught a canon, and there's a huge illiterate population of Algerians who are undereducated without rights and so on. So I'm not sure how many Algerians were aware of the book. Now it's taught, I'm not even sure if it's taught, might be taught in international schools or French schools, but it's not part of the curriculum since Arabization, obviously. It would be taught in a foreign language class, in a French class. There are translations of The Stranger, there are 2 translations of Stranger into Arabic, one done in Lebanon and the other in Egypt. And Kamel Daoud's book has been translated into Arabic. So I think he was going to Lebanon to do some readings. So, I mean, it's a really interesting question. Certainly the Algerians are very ambivalent about Camus. They're coming around to him because they're beginning, people didn't read his journalism in Algeria Republicaine, so they really didn't understand that not only was Camus anti-colonialist in the Republican terms, you know, of his period, but he lost his job because he was calling out, he was crying out against poverty in Kabylia, and the government shut down the newspaper, and he was forced to move to France and take a crummy job as a copy editor at Paris Soir, and that's where he wrote The Stranger. He wrote it in a crummy little hotel in Montmartre in about 6 weeks.
Thank you very much, Alice.